Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a devastating historical event that pushed one of the most powerful, deeply complex empires on Earth to its absolute breaking point. We're talking about the Aztec Empire. Now, this was a civilization completely renowned for its vast wealth, brilliant engineering, and a formidable military. But today, we're actually not focusing on their conquests. Instead, we're going to explore what happens when an unstoppable environmental force collides head-on with a highly structured, densely populated society. Picture the year 1454. An environmental shift hits, and it causes such extreme desperation that Aztecs' families were pushed to do the unimaginable. They literally sold their own citizens, even their own children, just for corn. It was a period of starvation so profound, so devastating, that it completely shattered the normal rules of society. But how on earth did a civilization so rich and advanced find itself in such a horrifying position? Well, that brings us to our central inquiry question for today's explainer. Our North Star, if you will, as we navigate this tragedy. We really want to understand, to what extent did the famine of one rabbit cause disruption in Aztec society? Because we aren't just looking at the weather here. We're looking at how a massive environmental crisis rippled through the economy, the government, and the very core belief systems of the Aztec people. Here's our agenda for today. We'll start with the environmental causes, look at the vulnerabilities, examine the human consequences, discuss the state and religious responses, spend some time evaluating the historical evidence, and finally, answer that main inquiry question. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Environmental Causes. You know, the Valley of Mexico actually had abundant water resources, but its climate was notoriously fickle. 16th century Aztec records, which, amazingly, are completely backed up by modern climate-sensitive tree ring data, show a massive drought slamming the region. It started in 1452, bringing prolonged dry conditions right around Lake Texcoco. By 1453, crops were failing, and those crucial food reserves were running dry. And then it all climaxed in 1454. In the Aztec calendar, this was known as the Year of One Rabbit, and it brought incredibly erratic weather and total agricultural collapse. Moving on to Section 2, Vulnerabilities. So we really need to understand exactly why such a powerful, densely populated empire was brought to its knees just by a lack of rain. Because a drought is an event, right? But a famine is a systemic failure. The core vulnerability here lay in their agriculture. Normally, Aztec maize is incredibly productive, but it's heavily dependent on predictable rainfall. The fatal blow in 1454 wasn't just a lack of water, it was a devastating anomaly. The deadly combination of late rains, which delayed planting, followed by an early frost, delivered a brutal 1-2 punch that wiped out the entire food supply in the High Valley. Historian Inga Clendenin really hits the nail on the head here. She notes that this crisis demonstrated the fragility of an urban society that depended heavily upon tribute and markets. Think about it. The Aztec capital was densely populated with virtually zero spare capacity. So, when the surrounding regions also suffered drought, the normal tribute systems, which were basically funneling food into the capital, were placed under enormous, absolutely unbearable pressure.
That brings us to Section 3, Human Consequences.
This systemic fragility led to just horrific outcomes, bringing ordinary economic and social life to a grinding halt. When the food stopped flowing, society began to unravel in a terrifying domino effect. First, crop failures slashed the food supply. As panic set in, those shortages quickly exhausted whatever stored reserves people had managed to keep. Then those vital tribute systems failed because local regions simply had no surplus food to give. Finally, the markets completely collapsed. Farmers abandoned their fields, people started migrating toward the mountains and lake shores, just desperately searching for wild birds or fish. People became weak, sick, and died right along the roads. And this leads us to the absolute darkest reality of the crisis. In the most shocking disruption of their social structure, starving families objectively resorted to trading their own children into slavery. They sold them to less affected groups, specifically the Huaxtecs and Totonacs over in the eastern regions, just to get handfuls of maize to survive. It's heartbreaking, and it really shows that this famine didn't just cause death. It completely shattered families, communities, and fundamental economic relationships. Let's look at Section 4, State and Religious Responses. Faced with this massive existential threat, the Aztec state and religious institutions had to mobilize immediate and desperate measures. On the political front, the Aztec ruler Moctezuma I attempted to redistribute grain from the royal warehouses. But those sophisticated storage systems were just quickly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the crisis. So, what did the state do next? They turned to the military. Moctezuma launched expeditions towards the edges of the empire, into the Mixtec and Eastern territories. It's fascinating because it shows a direct link between environmental crisis and foreign policy. Military expansion essentially became a tool to forcibly acquire agricultural surpluses from unaffected lowland areas. But we have to remember, to the Aztecs, a drought wasn't just a meteorological event. It had profound religious meaning. This was a spiritual crisis. This brings us to Tlaloc, the incredibly powerful Aztec god of rain, and his divine attendants, the Tlaloque. The state responded to the drought with intense festivals, huge processions at springs and mountaintop shrines, and fervent offerings to Tlaloc and the maize deity Xicomacoatl, basically begging for the rains to return. As an extraordinary measure to prevent complete social collapse, the authorities resorted to mass sacrifices. Because children were associated with purity and their tears with rain, children were actually sacrificed to Tlaloc. The Aztecs believed this incredibly intense, extreme form of devotion was literally the only way to persuade the gods to save their civilization. It's a stark, brutal reminder of how deeply agriculture, climate, and religious belief were intertwined in their world. Okay, Section 5, Evaluating Evidence. So, how do historians actually know all these complex details of an ancient crisis? Well, understanding the past requires looking at different types of evidence and really weighing their strengths and limitations. Historians have to triangulate things. We rely on modern experts, like Richard Townsend, to synthesize research on the social devastation. We use archaeological remains, which give us undeniable physical proof of events like mass sacrifice, directly confirming the written accounts. And we analyze indigenous pictographic records to see exactly how the Aztecs themselves recorded the disaster. A massive piece of that puzzle is the Codex Telleriano-Ramensis. It's this vital 16th century manuscript that visually depicts the famine, showing the dust storms, the dead victims, and the mass migration. But here's the catch. Because it was produced during the colonial period and heavily annotated by the Spanish, historians always have to consider the context and the perspective of those Spanish annotations when they're trying to interpret the authentic indigenous meaning behind the images. Finally, Section 6. Answering the inquiry question. Let's pull all these historical threads together. To what extent did the famine of one rabbit cause disruption in Aztec society? Well, the logic here is pretty clear. An unpredictable environmental trigger, that nasty combo of drought and early frost, exposed inherent underlying political and economic weaknesses. Because that dense population relied on a tribute system with no spare capacity, massive social and political consequences inevitably followed. The drought was merely the trigger. It was the heavily centralized, tribute-reliant structure of Aztec society itself that amplified a lack of rain into a total systemic collapse. Ultimately, the famine of one rabbit caused extensive, devastating disruption across the board. It intensified from a simple meteorological event into a full-blown societal crisis. It didn't merely cause people to go hungry. It fundamentally disrupted their agriculture, their markets, their migration patterns, family structures, government policies, foreign warfare, and religious practices. Literally every single pillar of the Aztec world was shaken to its core. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this thought. We so often view history as something distant, happening to people entirely different from us. But as you consider this historical domino effect, where a change in weather broke supply chains, collapsed markets, and forced desperate human migrations, ask yourself this: what modern political and economic vulnerabilities might be exposed by a sudden environmental crisis in our highly interconnected, densely populated society today? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating and honestly sobering piece of history with me.